I went to a flower shop to buy flowers for my wife's birthday. When I walked in, the owner grabbed my arm and pulled me into a back room. Hide. Don't make a sound. I didn't understand. 10 minutes later, my wife and son-in-law walked in, and what I heard next forced me to execute a plan that would destroy them both. If you are watching this video, please like and subscribe to my channel, and tell me in the comments where you are listening to my story of revenge from. I want to know how far it has traveled. The bell above the door of Maria's Floral Designs chimed a cheerful, familiar note as I pushed it open. The scent of damp earth, cut stems, and blooming lilies washed over me. I was 65, supposedly entering the golden years of my life, but I felt 90. The fatigue was a heavy leaden blanket I couldn't seem to shake off, no matter how many hours I slept or how many vitamins I took. It was the reason I had recently stepped back from the daily grind of running Gallagher Logistics, the company I built from a single delivery truck into a regional powerhouse. I had handed the operational reins to Cameron, my 35-year-old son-in-law. Cameron was sharp, ambitious, and hungry, exactly the kind of man I thought my daughter Rachel deserved, and exactly the kind of man I thought the company needed. He was handling the transition smoothly, or so I believed, while I focused on getting my health back. Today was Diane's 62nd birthday. Diane, my wife of 38 years, the woman who had stood by me when we had nothing but a rented apartment and a pile of bills. I was here to buy her favorite blue orchids, a tradition I hadn't missed since our 5th anniversary. Maria was at the counter arranging a sprawling bouquet of white hydrangeas. Her shop was thriving now, a local staple. But 5 years ago, she had been drowning in debt, weeks away from foreclosure. I had quietly bought the building her shop was in and restructured her lease, giving her the breathing room she needed to survive. She never forgot it. We had a silent mutual respect. When she looked up and saw me, however, the professional, welcoming smile vanished. Her face drained of color, turning a stark, chalky white. She dropped the pruning shears she was holding. They clattered loudly against the tiled floor. "Mr. Gallagher." Her voice was a strained, frantic whisper. Before I could ask her what was wrong, she lunged around the counter. She grabbed my forearm with a grip that surprised me, her fingers digging into my jacket sleeve. "You need to hide. Right now." I stared at her, utterly confused. "Maria, what are you talking about?" "I just came for the orchids." She didn't explain. She shoved me, literally shoved me, toward the heavy insulated door of the walk-in cooler at the back of the shop. "Please, Mr. Gallagher, don't make a sound. Just hide." Her eyes were wide with a terror I couldn't comprehend. I stumbled backward into the frigid air of the cooler, the heavy door swinging shut behind me with a solid, airtight thud. I stood there, surrounded by buckets of roses and carnations, my breath fogging the air. My mind was reeling. I was a respected businessman in this town, not a teenager hiding from a security guard. I moved to push the door open to demand an explanation for this absurd behavior. Then the shop bell chimed again. Through the thick, frosted glass panel in the center of the cooler door, the shapes in the main shop were distorted, blurred by condensation. But I could see 2 figures walk in. I wiped a small circle of condensation from the glass with the sleeve of my coat. It was Diane, my wife. She was wearing the beige trench coat I had bought her for Christmas, and beside her was Cameron, my son-in-law. My initial thought was surprise. Perhaps they were planning a surprise party for Diane, coordinating the floral arrangements. Maybe Maria had panicked, trying not to ruin the surprise when I unexpectedly walked in. It was a logical conclusion, the kind of comforting lie you tell yourself before the world ends. But they weren't looking at flowers. Cameron turned to Diane. He reached out, not to guide her toward an arrangement, but to pull her close. And then right there in the middle of Maria's flower shop, my 35-year-old son-in-law kissed my 62-year-old wife. It wasn't a peck on the cheek or a familial embrace. It was passionate, hungry, and deeply intimate. The cold air in the cooler suddenly felt like a physical blow. The fatigue that had plagued me for months vanished, replaced by a surge of adrenaline so sharp it made my vision blur. my hands clenched into fists at my sides, my fingernails biting into my palms. I felt paralyzed, anchored to the concrete floor by the sheer impossibility of what I was witnessing. My wife and my daughter's husband. They broke apart, seemingly unaware of Maria, who was frantically organizing ribbons behind the counter. Her back turned to them, her shoulders hunched in obvious distress. Cameron leaned against a display table, running a hand through his dark hair. "Did you up his dosage this morning?" His voice carried clearly through the gap at the bottom of the cooler door. The words didn't compute immediately. Dosage, I thought. I took blood pressure medication, sure, but I handled that myself. Diane adjusted her scarf, her expression perfectly composed, almost bored. I doubled it in his coffee. Cameron let out a harsh, frustrated breath. "The buyout happens Friday, Diane. If his heart doesn't stop by the retirement gala, we lose the offshore transfer. The rival firm won't sign the final escrow release unless he's legally out of the picture. We can't wait for him to just waste away." Diane reached out and straightened Cameron's tie. A gesture so casual, so domestic. It made me sick to my stomach. The old fool suspects nothing. He thinks he's just getting older. The doctor said the symptoms mimic chronic fatigue. It's untraceable. He'll have a massive coronary before the gala. The autopsy will show natural causes, and the company will fall to us exactly as planned. We just need to hold our nerve. I stood in the freezing darkness of the cooler, the scent of damp flowers suddenly smelling like a funeral parlor. My wife wasn't just cheating on me with my son-in-law. They were actively murdering me. The debilitating fatigue, the sudden dizzy spells, the heavy feeling in my chest that had forced me to step away from the company I loved. It wasn't age, it wasn't stress, it was poison. I looked at the blue orchids I had intended to buy her. They sat in a bucket near my feet. I had been planning to write a card, telling her how much I appreciated her support during my recent health struggles. Through the glass, I watched them finalize their order for a centerpiece. Diane laughed at something Cameron said, a light melodic sound I had loved for almost 4 decades. They paid Maria, who kept her head down, avoiding their gaze. The bell chimed again, and they were gone. I remained in the cooler for a long time. The cold seeped into my bones, but it was nothing compared to the ice in my veins. They thought I was a tired old fool. They thought they had orchestrated the perfect corporate takeover using my own body as the ticking clock. They had underestimated me. I didn't build a logistics empire by being naive, and I certainly didn't survive 40 years in business without learning how to dismantle a threat. They wanted a funeral. I was going to give them one, but I would not be the one in the casket. The bell above the door chimed a final time, signaling their departure. I waited a full minute, listening to the silence of the flower shop, before pushing the heavy insulated door open. The sudden warmth of the room hit me, but I felt colder than I ever had in my entire life. Maria was standing behind the counter, her hands trembling as she swept up fallen leaves. She looked at me with eyes full of apologies she did not need to voice. I did not say a single word to her. Words were completely useless now. I simply gave her a brief nod, a silent promise that her secret was safe with me, and walked out the back door into the alley. My legs felt like lead. The fatigue that had plagued me for months, the heavy fog in my brain, and the deep ache in my joints flared up violently. It was the poison. It was the extra dose Diane had intentionally slipped into my morning coffee. I stumbled toward my car, leaning heavily against the rough brick wall of the alleyway, just to keep from collapsing on the pavement. Every breath I took was a grueling battle. My heart fluttered erratically in my chest, a terrifying physical reminder of the ticking clock Cameron had bragged about. But while my body was failing, my mind was sharper than it had been in over a year. The fog of confusion lifted completely, burned away by pure concentrated rage. I climbed into the driver's seat of my sedan and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I did not start the engine immediately. I sat there in the dim light of the alley, forcing myself to breathe slowly, to master the physical weakness threatening to pull me under. If I drove home right now and kicked down the front door, it would all be over. I could scream, I could accuse them, I could throw Diane out of the house, but what would that actually achieve? It would just be a messy domestic dispute. They would deny everything, claim I was delusional from my illness, and instantly destroy whatever financial documents they had forged for the buyout on Friday. I would be painted as a raving old man, and they would play the part of the concerned caretakers. I did not build a massive logistics empire by acting on blind impulse. Long before the custom-tailored suits and the corner offices, I spent my 20s hauling freight across the frozen highways of the Midwest. I drove 18-wheelers through blinding blizzards, sleeping in desolate truck stops, and fighting off hijackers who thought a young driver was an easy target. I learned early on that when someone comes for your life, you do not panic. You survive the initial hit, you assess the damage, and you strike back when they think they have already won the war. Diane and Cameron thought I was soft. They thought decades of wealth and comfort had dulled my survival instincts. They forgot where I came from. They forgot that beneath the gray hair and the expensive watch, I was still that gritty kid from the loading docks who knew how to take a severe beating and keep moving forward. I turned the key in the ignition. I did not drive toward my affluent neighborhood. I headed in the exact opposite direction, taking the winding back roads out of town. I needed a medical professional, but I could not go to my regular doctor. Diane meticulously attended all my appointments, playing the devoted wife. She had full access to my medical records. If I went to the local hospital, word would get back to her before I even left the waiting room. I drove for 45 agonizing minutes, fighting the crushing exhaustion, keeping the windows rolled down, so the freezing air would keep me awake until I crossed the county line into a quiet industrial town 3 municipalities over. I pulled into the parking lot of an independent urgent care clinic, a nondescript brick building sandwiched between a diner and an old hardware store. I walked up to the reception desk. The young nurse on duty asked for my insurance card. I pulled out a thick wad of $100 bills from my money clip and placed it firmly on the counter. I told her I was paying cash and that I needed absolute discretion, no insurance records, no digital trail. I demanded a comprehensive rapid toxicology screen and a full cardiac enzyme panel immediately. The cash worked its magic. Within 10 minutes, I was sitting in a sterile examination room with a needle in my arm, watching a silent technician draw several vials of my blood. The wait for the results was the longest hour of my life. I sat in a hard plastic chair staring at the blank white wall. The symptoms of the morning dose were peaking. My vision blurred slightly at the edges, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I focused all my willpower on the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, counting the seconds, refusing to let my heart give out. I replayed the conversation from the flower shop in my head over and over again, letting the sheer cruelty of their words fuel my survival instinct. The old fool suspects nothing. I repeated Diane's words to myself. They had planned to let me die right before my retirement gala, ensuring a smooth inheritance and the seamless transfer of my company. The door finally clicked open. An older doctor with tired eyes and a grim expression walked in holding a manila folder. He closed the door securely behind him and sat on the rolling stool facing me. He did not waste time with polite small talk. He looked at the charts and then looked directly into my eyes. He asked me if I was currently under the care of a cardiologist for severe arrhythmia. I told him I was not. He took a deep breath and slid the paper toward me across the small table. The toxicology screen showed lethal levels of a highly restricted synthetic medication used to dramatically slow the heart rate in patients with severe cardiac issues. For someone without those specific issues, taking this drug is essentially a slow chemical strangulation. The doctor explained that the drug is virtually untraceable in a standard autopsy unless the coroner specifically knows to look for it. It perfectly mimics the natural symptoms of chronic fatigue and eventually leads to massive sudden heart failure. The dose currently in my system was dangerously high. The doctor stated with absolute certainty that whoever was administering this to me was not trying to make me sick, They were actively trying to stop my heart. He reached for the phone on the wall, telling me he was legally obligated to call the police immediately and report an attempted homicide. I stood up and placed my hand over the phone, holding the receiver down. I looked the doctor in the eye and thanked him for saving my life. But I told him that calling the police right now would ruin everything. If the police knocked on my door today, Cameron and Diane would simply claim I must have accidentally taken the wrong medication. They would hire expensive lawyers post-bail and quietly erase the $20 million corporate buyout they had orchestrated behind my back. They would walk away with my money and leave me with a drawn-out, messy legal battle. I needed to catch them in the act of committing federal financial fraud. I needed the trap to snap shut on Friday at the retirement gala, with all their wealthy investors watching. The doctor reluctantly agreed to give me 48 hours before filing the official report, provided I promised not to return home under any circumstances. He prescribed a specific counteragent to flush the poison from my system and stabilize my heart rate. I took the pills immediately, feeling a small measure of relief, knowing I was no longer a walking time bomb. I walked out of the clinic and sat in my car. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the empty parking lot. I took out my phone. I had 3 missed calls from Diane, playing the role of the worried wife perfectly. I opened our text thread and typed out a lie that would buy me the time I needed. Truck broke down in the valley. The mechanic says it needs a new alternator. Staying at a motel out here tonight. Do not wait up. I hit send. A minute later, her reply popped up telling me to stay safe and that she loved me. The hypocrisy was sickening, but it meant she bought the lie completely. They thought they had another day to finalize their fake documents. They thought they were in total control of the board. They had no idea that the man they were trying to bury was now awake, armed with medical proof, and operating completely off their radar. I put the car in gear and drove into the night. The fatigue was gone. The hunt had officially begun. The morning sun barely crested the horizon as I pulled into the gravel parking lot of an old diner on the edge of the county line. It was Thursday. I had exactly 1 day left before the retirement gala. The counter-agent the doctor had given me was working its way through my system. The crushing lethargy that had anchored me to the floor for months was completely gone. In its place was a sharp, cold clarity. I walked inside the diner. The smell of black coffee and frying bacon hung heavy in the air. I chose a booth in the far back corner facing the door. I needed to see everyone who walked in. 10 minutes later, my daughter Rachel walked through the glass doors. Seeing her sent a fresh wave of agony crashing through my chest. Rachel was my only child. She was the absolute light of my life. I had spent my entire adult life building Gallagher Logistics, so she would never have to know the struggles I faced. I had paid for her college, funded her wedding to Cameron, and handed him the keys to my empire because I believed he loved her. Now, looking at her tired but smiling face, I realized my protection had only made her a perfect target. She slid into the booth across from me, unwinding her scarf. She looked at me with genuine concern. "Dad, are you okay? You look different today." She reached across the sticky Formica table and took my hand. I forced a gentle, reassuring smile. I told her I was just feeling a little better, that the rest at the motel had done me some good. I hated lying to her, but the stakes were too high. I signaled the waitress and ordered 2 black coffees. Rachel started talking about her morning, about her dog, about the little mundane details of a life she believed was perfectly safe. I listened to her voice, letting it ground me. But beneath the surface, my mind was running 1,000 calculations a minute. I needed to know exactly how deep Cameron had dug his claws into her legal assets, without alerting her to the fact that I knew he was a monster. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the bitter liquid burn my tongue. I casually shifted the conversation toward the company. I asked her how Cameron was holding up with the transition. I mentioned that the logistics business could be overwhelming, and I wanted to make sure he was not buckling under the pressure of the upcoming buyout. Rachel smiled a soft, proud smile that absolutely shattered my heart. "Oh, Dad, you do not need to worry about Cameron," she said, her voice full of naive admiration. "He is working so incredibly hard for us. He has been staying up late every single night going over the financials. He wants everything to be perfect for your retirement gala on Friday." I kept my face entirely neutral. I asked her if he was handling all that paperwork alone. Rachel shook her head. "No, actually, Mom has been a huge help to him. They spend hours in the study going over estate planning. Cameron said they want to make sure all the asset transfers are completely seamless, so you do not have to lift a finger once you step down. They just want to ease your burden, Dad." I stared at my daughter. The sheer psychological cruelty of what Diane and Cameron were doing was almost impossible to comprehend. They were sitting in my own home, in my own study, plotting my murder and stealing my life work, and they had convinced my beautiful daughter that they were doing it out of love and devotion. They were using her inherent trust as a shield to orchestrate my death. I took another slow breath, controlling the violent rage that wanted to explode out of me. I nodded slowly, telling her how grateful I was for their hard work. Then I cast my line. I asked Rachel if Cameron had finalized her shares of the company. When I built Gallagher Logistics, I had placed 30% of the voting shares directly in a private trust under Rachel's name. It was her safety net, an untouchable asset meant to protect her forever. Rachel waved her hand dismissively as if it were a trivial detail. "Oh yes, we took care of that last week," she said, blowing on her hot coffee. "Cameron had me sign some consolidation forms. We moved my shares into a joint marital trust. He said it was much better for tax purposes, and it would make the corporate buyout on Friday run much smoother. He said the rival firm prefers dealing with a single unified holding entity." The diner around me seemed to fade into complete silence. My blood ran absolute ice cold. A joint marital trust. Cameron had convinced her to sign over her sole legal protection. He was legally absorbing her entire inheritance before my heart even stopped beating. If Cameron and Diane executed the $20 million buyout on Friday, Cameron would control Rachel's portion entirely. He could liquidate the funds, transfer them to the offshore account Diane had set up, and leave Rachel with absolutely nothing. Worse, because her name was tied to the joint trust, she would be legally implicated when the federal authorities inevitably investigated the fraudulent sale of my company. They were not just going to leave her penniless. They were going to leave her to take the fall for their corporate crimes. The urge to reach across the table, grab my daughter by the shoulders, and tell her the horrifying truth was almost unbearable. I wanted to scream that her husband was sleeping with her mother. I wanted to tell her that the coffee she poured me yesterday was laced with lethal heart medication. I wanted to pull her out of that booth, put her in my car, and drive as far away from Cameron and Diane as humanly possible. But I looked into her innocent, trusting eyes, and I knew I could not say a single word. If I told Rachel the truth right now in this diner, she would completely break down. Her emotional reaction would be massive and uncontrollable. She would immediately call Cameron demanding answers, or she would confront her mother. The element of surprise was the only weapon I had left. If Cameron realized I knew about the poison and the forged documents, he would instantly destroy the evidence and cancel the Friday buyout. He would cover his tracks, and I would lose the ability to put him in federal prison. I had to let my daughter continue believing she was married to a good man for exactly 36 more hours. I forced myself to smile affectionately at her. I reached across the table and patted her hand. "That is wonderful, sweetheart," I told her, lying through my teeth. "Cameron really is thinking of everything. But you know, I actually have a small favor to ask you." I told her that my private wealth manager needed to restructure one of my personal retirement accounts before the gala. I invented a story about a complex tax loophole that required her signature as my primary beneficiary to temporarily hold some of my private assets in a separate blind trust. I told her it was just a bureaucratic formality, a boring piece of paper to make sure the government did not take a massive cut of my personal savings. Rachel did not even hesitate. "Of course, Dad," she said, smiling warmly. "Whatever you need, just tell me where to sign." Her absolute blind faith in me was the exact opposite of the manipulation she suffered under Cameron. She trusted me completely, and I was going to use that trust to save her life. I told her my lawyer Wallace would email her a secure digital document later that afternoon. I specifically instructed her not to mention it to Cameron. I chuckled and played the part of the stubborn old businessman. "Tell Cameron this is my own private retirement money," I said, winking at her. "He already controls the logistics empire. Let an old man keep his personal secrets." Rachel laughed, a bright, beautiful sound that echoed in the small diner. She promised to keep it our little secret. She had no idea that the document Wallace was going to send her would be an emergency legal severance. It would secretly detach her financial identity from Cameron Joint Trust and shield her assets behind an impenetrable legal wall. When the federal guillotine dropped on Friday night, Cameron would find himself completely cut off from her money, and Rachel would be completely insulated from his crimes. We finished our coffee. I walked her to her car and hugged her tighter than I had in years. I stood in the gravel parking lot long after her car disappeared from view. The morning air was biting, but I hardly felt the cold. The betrayal I had witnessed in the flower shop had wounded me as a husband, but discovering Cameron planned to destroy my daughter ignited a completely different kind of fire within me. A husband might mourn a broken marriage, but a father will burn the entire world to the ground to protect his child. Cameron thought he was playing a high-level game of corporate chess. He thought he had outsmarted a tired old man, but he had made the fatal mistake of threatening the only thing I truly valued. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The radio played softly in the background, a meaningless drone against the sharp calculations running through my head. I had successfully secured Rachel blind cooperation. By this evening, her financial signature would be completely isolated from Cameron toxic fraud. But simply saving her money was not enough. Cameron and Diane needed to pay for every lie they had spun, every dose of poison they had poured, every moment they had mocked me behind my back. I pulled out my phone and prepared to make a call. The domestic surveillance phase was over. It was time to initiate the corporate execution. I pulled out of the diner parking lot, leaving my daughter safely in the dark. The counter agent I took at the clinic was doing its job holding back the poison Diane had fed me. My hands on the steering wheel were perfectly steady. I was no longer the exhausted, fading patriarch my family thought I was. I was a man preparing for war. I drove straight into the heart of the financial district. I bypassed the retail banks with their glass walls and friendly tellers. I went to the First Fidelity Depository, a private high-security institution built like a fortress of granite and steel. This was where the real leverage was kept, far away from my home office and far away from Diane prying eyes. I parked in the underground garage and took the private elevator to the basement level. The air down there was always cold and smelled faintly of oiled metal and old paper. The vault manager recognized me immediately. He did not ask questions. He simply guided me through the heavy steel doors after verifying my identification. We walked down the silent rows of safe deposit boxes until we reached mine, number 404. I inserted my brass key, he inserted his, and the heavy lock tumbled open. He left me alone in the small private viewing room. I sat down at the polished wooden table and opened the long metal box. Inside lay the entire foundation of my life work. I bypassed the stacks of emergency cash and the property deeds. I reached straight for the bottom and pulled out a thick leather-bound folder. It contained the original operating agreements for Gallagher Logistics. The pages were crisp, the ink slightly faded from the passage of 20 years. I ran my fingers over the paper, remembering the day I signed them. When I transitioned from a guy with a few delivery trucks to the owner of a massive corporate fleet, I knew the rules of the game had changed. The corporate world is not built on handshakes and promises. It is built by sharks wearing tailored suits waiting for you to bleed. I never fully trusted that world, and I never fully trusted the lawyers and executives who smiled at me across boardroom tables. Because of that paranoia, I forced my original legal team to bury a specific clause deep within the company bylaws. It was my poison pill. It was a failsafe designed to protect my empire from hostile takeovers and greedy executives. The clause stated that the absolute sale or liquidation of Gallagher Logistics could never be executed by proxy. It did not matter if someone held a general power of attorney. It did not matter if I was in a coma. The final authorization for a corporate buyout required my living physical thumbprint on a biometric scanner and a highly specific secondary passcode delivered in person to the primary escrow agent. Cameron thought he was a genius. He thought that because I had handed him the title of acting chief executive and given him operational control, he held the keys to the kingdom. He thought he could just sign a few papers and sell my life work out from under me. He was driving a multi-million-dollar machine, but he had absolutely no idea that I still held the engine. I dug deeper into the metal box, pulling out the sealed envelopes that the bank automatically routed here instead of my home address. These were the high-level corporate banking notices, the ones Diane never saw. I tore open the most recent envelope and laid the documents out on the table. My breath caught in my throat as I read the crisp, typed letters. It was a preliminary notice of sale. Cameron and Diane had already initiated a buyout protocol with Apex Dynamics, our most ruthless competitor. I scanned the financial terms. $20 million. They were selling out my entire fleet, my warehouses, my contracts for $20 million in clean, untraceable cash. I looked down at the signature line on the authorization forms. There, resting innocently on the white paper, was a flawless forgery of my own signature. I stared at the loops and angles of the ink. Diane had always possessed a meticulous nature. She must have spent weeks practicing my handwriting, perfectly replicating the slight slant of my letters. They had already submitted these preliminary documents to the escrow firm locking the agreement in place. I sat back in the leather chair, the cold reality of their plan washing over me. They intended to pocket the $20 million and simply vanish, leaving my company dismantled and my daughter legally exposed to the fallout. But as I read the fine print of the escrow instructions, the final piece of their murderous puzzle clicked into place. The $20 million was currently sitting in a secure holding account pending final execution. The transaction was set to clear on Friday night. Friday was the date of my grand retirement gala. They had chosen that exact night to finalize the sale. Everything Cameron had bragged about in the flower shop made absolute sense now. They needed my heart to stop before the gala, because if I died, their forged power of attorney documents would temporarily allow them to push the sale through probate before my poison pill clause could be triggered. They needed a corpse to complete the transaction. I looked at the forged signature again. A sudden, fierce clarity took hold of me. If I drove back to my house right now and confronted them with these papers, it would be a disaster. They would panic. They would claim it was a misunderstanding or a draft they never intended to use. It would become a localized domestic dispute. The police might charge them with attempted forgery, but they would hire expensive defense attorneys. They would twist the narrative claiming I was a confused old man. They might even escape prison time. I did not want a domestic dispute. I did not want them to get a slap on the wrist. I wanted to completely annihilate them. I realized that the pending status of the $20 million was not a problem. It was the ultimate weapon. If they simply forged a document, it was a state-level crime. But if they attempted to execute a $20 million fraudulent wire transfer across state lines to an offshore holding account using a dead man forged signature, it instantly became a massive federal crime. Wire fraud, corporate espionage, criminal conspiracy to commit financial ruin. I did not just need to survive their poison. I needed to trap them. I had to let them believe their plan was working perfectly. I had to let them walk right up to the edge of that $20 million cliff and proudly leap off. I had to allow the escrow process to reach the absolute point of no return. Only then, when the federal wire transfer was initiated in front of hundreds of witnesses at the gala, would I snap the trap shut. I carefully folded the forged documents and the original bylaws, sliding them into a secure leather portfolio. I locked the metal box and returned it to the vault manager. I walked out of the bank and stepped into the bustling city street. The sun was shining brightly, but my mind was completely submerged in shadows. They wanted a $20 million payday. I was going to give them a federal prison sentence. I walked to my car, the plan solidifying in my mind with cold, ruthless precision. It was time to find a lawyer who enjoyed destroying lives just as much as I did. I left the bank and drove straight into the heart of the city. I parked beneath a skyscraper of gleaming glass and steel. I took the express elevator to the 50th floor. The doors opened to a lobby of black marble. This was the headquarters of Wallace Reed. Wallace was not a family lawyer. He did not handle messy divorces or petty custody disputes. He was a high-end corporate attorney. He was a shark in a tailored suit who specialized in hostile takeovers and destroying fraudsters. He was exactly the kind of monster I needed on my side. I walked into his massive corner office. The walls were entirely glass, looking down on the city like a predatory bird. Wallace was sitting behind a desk made of solid mahogany. He looked up from his laptop. He did not smile. We had done business a decade ago when I crushed a rival logistics firm that tried to steal my supply chains. He respected me, but he did not like unannounced visits. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I sat in the leather chair across from him. I placed my phone flat on the polished wood of his desk. I told him to listen closely. I hit play. The audio I had recorded in the freezing dark of the flower shop cooler began to play. The sound of the shop bell ringing, the rustle of clothing, and then the voices. Cameron asking if Diane had upped my dosage. Diane replying coldly that she doubled it in my coffee. Cameron complaining that if my heart did not stop by the retirement gala, they would lose the $20 million offshore transfer. Diane reassuring him that the old fool suspects nothing. The recording ended. The silence in the massive office was absolute. Wallace stared at the phone. He slowly closed his laptop. The annoyance that had been on his face when I walked in was completely gone. In its place was the cold, calculating gaze of a predator who had just smelled blood in the water. He leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. He looked at me with a mixture of professional respect and grim realization. He asked me how long I had known. I told him I found out exactly 2 hours before I walked into his office. Wallace stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. He looked out over the city skyline. Then he turned around and delivered a brutal dose of legal reality. He told me that confronting them with just that audio recording would be a catastrophic mistake. In the court of public opinion, the audio was damning. But in a criminal courtroom, it was incredibly vulnerable. Defense attorneys would tear it to shreds. They would claim it was a private conversation taken out of context. They would argue that Cameron and Diane share a dark, morbid sense of humor. They would say they were joking about a television show or rehearsing lines for a play. Without a body, the police might hesitate to press severe charges based solely on a muffled recording. Wallace walked back to his desk. He leaned over, placing his palms flat on the wood. He told me that if we wanted to put them in prison, we needed a flawless, undeniable paper trail. We needed to prove the embezzlement step by step. We needed financial records showing exactly how Cameron was moving the money. We needed proof of the forged signatures on the sale documents. And most importantly, we needed to connect Diane to the poison. We needed security footage or credit card receipts showing her purchasing the untraceable heart medication. Audio is just noise, Wallace said, his voice low and serious. Paper is a prison sentence. I reached into my briefcase. I pulled out the copies of the forged preliminary sale documents I had retrieved from the bank vault. I placed them on the desk. I told Wallace that Cameron and Diane had already initiated a buyout with my biggest corporate rival. They had forged my signature to authorize a $20 million sale of my logistics fleet. Wallace picked up the papers. His eyes scanned the legal jargon and the forged signature. He saw the routing numbers for the offshore holding company. The legal sniper inside Wallace immediately took over. He grabbed his desk phone. He told me he was going to call a federal judge he played golf with. He said he would draft an emergency injunction within the hour. We could freeze the offshore accounts by noon. We could lock down every single asset tied to the logistics firm. We could paralyze Cameron corporate access and stop the bleeding immediately. We could catch them in the act of preparing the fraud. I stood up. I reached across the desk and firmly pressed my hand down on the phone receiver, cutting off the dial tone. Wallace looked at me in shock. I stared right back at him. I told him no. I told him we were not freezing a single dime. Wallace was furious. He demanded to know why I would let a $20 million fraudulent sale proceed. He warned me that if the money hit that offshore account, it would be gone forever, washed through a dozen shell companies before the sun went down. He said stopping the transfer right now was the only way to protect my life work. I shook my head. I explained that freezing the accounts today would simply warn the prey. The moment Cameron received a notification that the holding company was locked down, he would panic. He would know I was onto him. He would immediately destroy the remaining poison. He would shred the physical copies of the final sale contracts. He and Diane would hire top-tier defense lawyers before the police even knocked on their door. They would claim the forged signature was a misunderstanding executed by an overzealous secretary. They would walk away with a slap on the wrist, and I would have to spend the rest of my life watching my back. I looked Wallace dead in the eye and laid out the real strategy. I told him we were going to quietly let the entire transaction proceed. We were going to let the rival firm deposit the $20 million into the secure escrow account. We were going to let Cameron and Diane believe they had achieved total victory. I explained the trap. As long as they were just signing preliminary papers, it was a state-level forgery issue. But the moment they attempted to execute the final transfer of $20 million across state lines to a foreign bank using the forged signature of a man they intended to murder, it transformed instantly into a massive federal crime. I wanted wire fraud. I wanted corporate espionage. I wanted federal conspiracy charges with mandatory minimum sentences. I did not want them to face a friendly local judge. I wanted them facing federal prosecutors who do not make deals. Wallace slowly pulled his hand away from the phone. The anger on his face dissolved into a look of absolute predatory awe. He finally understood the sheer magnitude of the trap I was building. He sat back down. He picked up his expensive silver pen and smiled a slow, dangerous smile. He told me it was the most ruthless legal maneuver he had ever heard. I told him my wife and son-in-law wanted a corporate execution, and I was simply going to give them one. We had exactly 24 hours to build an airtight federal cage before the grand retirement gala. The legal sniper went to work. The drive back to my sprawling suburban estate took exactly 32 minutes. I used every single one of those minutes to bury the cold, ruthless corporate predator I had become in Wallace Reed office and resurrect the fragile, exhausted old man my wife expected to walk through the front door. I pulled my sedan into the wide, circular driveway and parked near the manicured hedges. I turned off the engine and sat in the silence of the leather interior. I closed my eyes and forced my breathing to become shallow and labored. I let my shoulders slump forward perfectly, mimicking the crushing weight of the poison that was no longer ravaging my system. I opened the car door and stepped out onto the pristine paving stones, dragging my feet slightly, intentionally scuffing the soles of my shoes against the ground. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and pushed it open. The house was immaculately silent. The morning sunlight streamed through the massive skylights, reflecting off the polished marble floors of the foyer. It was a house built for entertaining high society, not for raising a family. I slowly made my way down the long corridor toward the kitchen, leaning a hand against the wall for support. My performance was flawless. Diane was standing by the massive granite kitchen island waiting for me. She wore a tailored silk blouse and perfectly pressed trousers, her hair impeccably styled. She looked like a woman preparing for a high-end charity luncheon, not a wife tending to a dying husband. but as soon as I crossed the threshold, her face arranged itself into a mask of deep maternal concern. She rushed across the kitchen floor, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. She wrapped her arms around my neck and kissed my cheek. Her perfume filled my lungs, the same expensive floral scent I had bought her for our anniversary. It took every ounce of willpower I possessed not to push her away. "You look absolutely terrible, darling," she murmured, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You should not have stayed at that awful motel. You need your rest." I coughed weakly and let my head fall forward. "The truck broke down," I rasped, making my voice sound thin and brittle. I did not have the energy to deal with a tow truck in the middle of the night. I just needed to sleep. Diane stroked my arm, guiding me toward the tall leather bar stools at the island. "Sit down," she instructed softly. "I made exactly what you need." I sat heavily on the stool, resting my elbows on the cold granite. I watched her walk over to the state-of-the-art espresso machine. She picked up a steaming ceramic mug and brought it over to me. The rich, bold aroma of my favorite dark roast coffee wafted through the air. She set the mug down right in front of me, sliding it gently across the polished stone. "Drink this," she urged, offering a warm, encouraging smile. "It will wake you up and give you the strength you need for tomorrow night." I stared down at the black liquid rippling inside the mug. A profound, freezing realization washed over me. Diane had just handed me a death sentence. In the 38 years we had been married, Diane had never brewed a single pot of coffee. She despised domestic chores. The moment my logistics company turned a massive profit 2 decades ago, she immediately hired a full-time housekeeper, a private chef, and a weekly cleaning crew. She used to joke with her country club friends that she did not even know how to turn the oven on. Her manicured hands were meant for holding champagne flutes and signing charity checks, never for operating kitchen appliances. The fact that she had personally stood by the machine, ground the beans, and poured this specific cup of coffee was the most glaring red flag she could have possibly waved. She was bypassing the hired staff to ensure there were absolutely no witnesses to the preparation of my morning beverage. I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic mug. I could feel her eyes locked onto me, watching my every move with the intense focus of a predator, waiting for the venom to take effect. I knew exactly what was inside that dark liquid. It was a double dose of the synthetic heart medication the urgent care doctor had warned me about. If I swallowed that coffee, my heart rate would plummet within minutes, and the catastrophic cardiac event they had planned for Friday night would hit me right here on the kitchen floor. I lifted the mug halfway to my mouth, letting the steam hit my face. I needed a distraction. I needed a window of exactly 3 seconds to dispose of the poison without her noticing. I slowly lowered the mug back to the counter and let out a long, trembling sigh. "Diane, my chest feels incredibly tight," I whispered, rubbing my breastbone with my free hand. "Do we have any of those antacids left in the upstairs bathroom cabinet?" Diane frowned, a flicker of genuine annoyance breaking through her facade of concern. She did not want to leave the room. She wanted to watch me drink it. "Just take a few sips of the coffee first," she insisted, pushing the mug an inch closer to my hand. "It will make you feel much better." I reached for the mug again, pretending my fingers were too weak to hold it steady. Right at that exact moment, a sharp electronic chime echoed through the kitchen. It was the distinct notification sound of a text message coming from Diane's phone resting on the counter behind her. She instinctively turned her head toward the screen. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I grabbed the mug and swung my arm to the left, where a massive potted decorative ficus tree sat in a heavy brass planter. I tipped the mug and poured the scalding poisoned coffee straight into the dark soil, hiding the liquid completely beneath the roots. I brought the mug back to my lips, tilting it back just as Diane turned around. I swallowed absolutely nothing, leaving only a wet rim of coffee on the ceramic edge. I slammed the empty mug down onto the granite counter with a loud clatter. I gasped sharply and gripped the edge of the island. I pushed myself backward off the stool, making my legs collapse beneath me. I hit the floor hard, letting my shoulder take the brunt of the impact. I curled my body inward, clutching my chest tightly with both hands. I began to take short, shallow breaths, forcing my face to turn red with the effort of faking a massive cardiac struggle. Vincent, Diane gasped, stepping back away from me. I looked up at her from the floor, letting my eyes roll back slightly. I reached a trembling hand toward her, begging for help, in a weak, raspy whisper. She did not reach down to help me up. She did not call for the housekeeper. She did not reach for the phone to dial emergency services. She stood perfectly still, looking down at me, lying on the cold marble floor. The mask of the devoted wife completely melted away. Her face relaxed into an expression of pure, absolute calculation. I watched through half-closed eyes as a dark, suppressed gleam of triumph illuminated her features. She looked at me not as a dying husband, but as a highly successful financial transaction that was finally clearing escrow. She watched me struggle for a full 60 seconds, ensuring the supposed poison was taking full effect. Then she slowly, calmly turned her back on me. She picked up her phone from the kitchen counter. Her thumbs moved rapidly across the glowing screen, typing out a message with practiced efficiency. The polished surface of the stainless steel refrigerator next to her acted as a perfect mirror, reflecting the glowing screen directly into my line of sight. I read the text she was sending to Cameron word for word. "It is working. He just collapsed in the kitchen. Get the final papers ready for tomorrow." She hit send. She placed the phone back down and finally turned around to look at me again. She crouched down next to my body, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder, putting the mask of the loving wife firmly back on just in case the housekeeper walked into the room. She softly whispered that I was just having a small spell and that I needed to rest for the big gala tomorrow. I closed my eyes entirely, letting my body go completely limp against the marble floor. I allowed her to believe she had won. I allowed her to believe the poison was dragging me down into the dark. But beneath the surface of my motionless body, my heart was beating with a steady, powerful rhythm. The trap was set. The prey was completely blind. I just had to wait for tomorrow night to drop the guillotine. I lay on the cold marble floor of my kitchen for another 20 minutes after Diane walked away. I needed to be absolutely certain she was completely out of earshot and occupied elsewhere in the massive house. When I finally heard the heavy oak doors of the master suite click shut on the second floor, I slowly pushed myself up. My muscles ached fiercely from the physical tension of my performance, but the medical counter agent I had taken at the urgent care clinic was holding my heart rate perfectly steady. I dusted off my trousers and walked down the long corridor into my private study, locking the heavy mahogany door securely behind me. I did not have the luxury of resting. The clock was aggressively ticking toward Friday night, and I had a massive amount of work to do. Exactly. At noon, a discreet knock sounded at the side entrance of the house, the door leading directly into my study from the garden path. I opened it to find a man in a gray utility jacket holding a thick manila envelope. He was the private investigator dispatched by my attorney, Wallace Reed. He did not introduce himself. He simply handed me the heavy package, gave a curt professional nod, and walked back down the garden path, disappearing into the suburban quiet, as if he had never been there. I locked the door again, closed the heavy velvet curtains over the windows, and carried the envelope to my desk. I sat down in my leather chair and broke the seal. A stack of high-definition glossy photographs slid out onto the polished wood, accompanied by several bound financial reports. I had already heard the audio of their betrayal. I had already seen them kissing passionately in the flower shop. But holding physical high-definition photographs of my wife and my son-in-law entering a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city brought a new wave of visceral, sickening disgust. The images were undeniably clear. Diane was wearing a silk scarf I had bought her in Paris, pulling it over her head in a pathetic attempt to hide her face while Cameron held the door of room 114 open for her. The private investigator had meticulously documented their movements, logging the exact dates and times. They had been visiting this specific cheap motel every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon for the past 8 months. The sheer indignity of it, the cheapness of a woman who normally demanded nothing but 5-star luxury, proved exactly how deeply she was compromised by this affair. Beneath the photographs was a detailed breakdown of their offshore banking structure. The investigator had traced the digital footprints Cameron recklessly left behind. There were pages of secret bank routing numbers, account aliases, and wire transfer protocols waiting like an open vault to receive the $20 million from the fraudulent corporate buyout. Cameron thought his digital trails were encrypted and invisible, but Wallace's team had carved them open like a surgical incision. I now possessed the exact coordinates of their escape route. I knew exactly where the money was supposed to go, which meant I knew exactly how to intercept it when the time came. But as I dug deeper into the second half of the dossier, the lingering disgust I felt toward my cheating wife was instantly obliterated by a wave of absolute terrifying panic. The private investigator had not just looked into the offshore accounts, he had audited Cameron's entire domestic financial history over the last 12 months. I turned the page and stared at a series of massive high-interest corporate loan agreements. They were illegal, unregulated shadow loans borrowed against the projected future earnings of Gallagher Logistics. The sheer volume of the debt was staggering, totaling nearly $8 million in toxic liabilities. It was not the amount of the debt that made my blood run completely cold. It was the name listed as the primary guarantor on every single document. Rachel. Cameron had not used his own name to secure these massive loans. He had exploited his marital status and used his position within my company to forge my daughter's signature on dozens of highly illegal financial documents. He had leveraged her pristine credit, her personal assets, and the shares she held in the joint trust to secure millions of dollars in untraceable cash. He had been quietly funneling this money into his own private ventures, burning through the cash to fund his lavish lifestyle, and his affair with Diane leaving a trail of catastrophic debt entirely in Rachel's name. The full scope of Cameron depravity finally snapped into perfect focus. He was not just planning to steal $20 million and run away with my wife. He was planning to leave my only child completely destroyed in his wake. If the $20 million buyout cleared escrow on Friday night, Cameron and Diane would instantly wire the funds to their untraceable offshore accounts and vanish across international borders. When the dust settled and the federal authorities inevitably realized the buyout was a fraudulent scam, they would not be able to reach Cameron. Instead, the government, the corporate lawyers, and the shadow lenders would come looking for the person whose name was plastered all over the toxic loan agreements. They would come for Rachel. My beautiful, innocent daughter would be hit with $8 million in fraudulent debt. She would be stripped of her home and her savings. She would be dragged into federal court, facing potential prison time for massive corporate fraud she knew absolutely nothing about. Cameron had meticulously engineered a scenario where Rachel would serve as his ultimate legal scapegoat, taking the horrific fall for his crimes while he lived in luxury with her own mother. I dropped the documents onto the desk and pressed my hands over my face. My breathing became ragged, not from any trace of poison, but from the sheer terrifying weight of what was about to happen to my daughter. I had only 24 hours left before the grand retirement gala. 24 hours before Cameron initiated the wire transfer that would pull the trigger on Rachel's financial execution. I could not simply call the police right now. If I sent the police to arrest Cameron for the forged loans today, he would panic. He would hire high-powered defense attorneys, claim the loans were legitimate business mistakes, and drag Rachel into a decade-long legal nightmare trying to untangle her name from the mess. The burden of proof would fall on her to show she did not sign those papers, a process that would bankrupt her in legal fees alone. I needed to completely obliterate the debt, and I needed to do it invisibly. I had to systematically dismantle every single safety net Cameron had built for himself without triggering a single alarm bell in his head. He needed to walk onto that stage tomorrow night, believing he was a king, completely unaware that his kingdom had already been burned to ashes. I stood up from my desk, leaving the photographs of Diane and Cameron scattered across the wood. The betrayal of my marriage no longer mattered. The pain of my failing health was entirely forgotten. I was no longer a betrayed husband or a dying man. I was a father preparing to slaughter the predators threatening his child. I picked up my secure mobile phone and dialed a number I had not called in 3 years. I needed to arrange a very quiet, completely untraceable shadow meeting with the one person who had the power to neutralize Cameron corporate moves. I needed to meet with the chief executive officer of the rival logistics firm, the very man Cameron was currently trying to sell my stolen empire to. I had less than 1 day to rewrite the rules of this deadly corporate game, and I was going to make sure that when the curtain finally fell on Friday night, Cameron and Diane would be the ones left with absolutely nothing. I parked my sedan in the dark alley behind the rusted brick building of an old steakhouse on the south side of the city. It was a place untouched by modern corporate culture. The air inside smelled of roasted meat and aged leather. The dim amber lights offered complete anonymity. I walked through the heavy wooden doors and gave the host a quiet nod. He guided me past the crowded main dining room and down a narrow hallway into a private soundproof booth. I sat at the round table and waited. I had exactly 20 hours before the retirement gala began. Every second was a precious commodity. 10 minutes later, the heavy curtain pulled back. Malcolm Stanton walked into the booth. Malcolm was the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Dynamics. They were my largest and most aggressive corporate rival. We had spent the last 2 decades fighting over shipping routes and supply chains. He was a massive man with broad shoulders and a thick silver beard. He did not wear a tailored suit, but rather a simple button-down shirt and heavy boots. Malcolm and I were cut from the exact same cloth. We both started out driving 18-wheelers through the freezing rain and built our logistics empires through sheer willpower. We were ruthless competitors, but we shared a deep, unspoken respect for the old ways of doing business. Malcolm sat heavily across from me and ordered a black coffee from the passing waiter. He looked at me with his piercing dark eyes, noting that I looked terrible. I told him appearances could be deceiving. He leaned forward, resting his massive forearms on the polished wood table. He asked why the owner of Gallagher Logistics was calling a secret shadow meeting with his biggest rival less than a day before a corporate buyout was supposed to be finalized. He noted that my son-in-law had been handling all the negotiations. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out the forged preliminary sale documents I had taken from the bank vault. I slid them across the table. I watched Malcolm pick up the papers. He scanned the contract terms and the forged signature at the bottom. He noted the offshore holding account routing numbers. He asked if I was getting cold feet about the $20 million buyout. I looked him dead in the eye. I told him I never authorized the sale. I explained that the signature on that document was a complete forgery. I told him Cameron was attempting to illegally liquidate my entire life work and funnel the cash into a foreign account before vanishing completely. Malcolm stopped reading. The relaxed posture disappeared entirely. The air in the private booth grew thick with sudden tension. Malcolm was a ruthless businessman, but he possessed a strict moral code. He despised the modern corporate culture filled with slick young executives who wanted to make millions without ever getting their hands dirty. He viewed men like Cameron as parasites. Malcolm placed the documents back on the table. His voice was dangerously low when he asked if I was absolutely certain. I opened the second folder and handed him the undeniable proof. I showed him the private investigative photographs. I showed him the shadow loans Cameron had illegally taken out, using my daughter as the primary guarantor. I laid out the entire financial web of deceit, piece by piece. I did not mention the poison Diane had given me. I did not need to involve the personal betrayal of my marriage. This was strictly a corporate execution. I needed Malcolm to see the financial fraud staring him right in the face. Malcolm stared at the evidence of Cameron destroying my daughter to fund his escape. His jaw clenched tight. The betrayal offended every single traditional business principle he held. He slowly pushed his coffee aside. He realized that if his company deposited $20 million into that offshore account tomorrow night, he would be blindly participating in a massive federal wire fraud scheme. Cameron was attempting to turn Apex Dynamics into an unwitting accomplice to steal my company. Malcolm looked up at me. The rivalry between us vanished completely. He asked what I wanted him to do. He offered to call his legal team immediately and cancel the escrow transfer, preventing the sale from moving forward. I shook my head. I told him canceling the transfer would simply warn Cameron that his cover was blown. If Cameron realized the deal was dead, he would panic and flee the country tonight, leaving my daughter trapped under millions of dollars in fraudulent debt. I needed Cameron to remain completely confident. I needed him to walk onto the stage at the retirement gala tomorrow night, believing he had absolute control. I reached into my portfolio one last time, pulling out a brand new, completely legitimate operating agreement. I slid it across the table to Malcolm. I told him I was offering him a legitimate buyout of my entire logistics fleet. I offered him a heavily discounted price, far below the $20 million Cameron was asking for. I told him he could absorb my supply chains, take over my shipping routes, and officially make Apex Dynamics the undisputed king of the regional market. It was an incredibly lucrative deal that would make his board of directors ecstatic. I was willing to sacrifice a massive portion of my corporate wealth to save my daughter and destroy my enemies. Malcolm read the legitimate contract, seeing the incredibly low asking price. He knew it was the deal of a lifetime. He looked back up at me, waiting for the catch. He knew a man like me never hands over his empire without a specific condition. I leaned across the table and told him the new contract was his on one absolute condition. I needed him to attend the retirement gala tomorrow night. I needed him to put on a tuxedo and play along with Cameron's entire charade. I told him he had to walk up to that stage in front of 200 wealthy investors and politicians. He needed to shake Cameron's hand and pretend to close the fraudulent deal. But instead of handing Cameron the final escrow release, I needed Malcolm to hand him something else. Malcolm listened intently as I outlined the final steps of the trap. I needed him to be the one who physically delivered the final fake contracts right in front of the crowd. I needed the handover to happen exactly when my legal team and the federal authorities were moving into position. Malcolm would be the bait that kept Cameron standing on that stage until the steel jaws of the trap snapped shut. Malcolm sat back in his chair, letting a slow, dark smile spread across his weathered face. The prospect of publicly humiliating a corporate parasite like Cameron appealed to him immensely. He picked up his pen and signed the legitimate discounted buyout agreement without a second thought, folding the paper and sliding it into his coat pocket. He promised he would be at the country club by 7:00 sharp. He promised he would wear his best tuxedo and play the part perfectly. We shook hands across the table, securing a firm, solid agreement between two men who understood the true cost of doing business. I left the steakhouse and walked back to my car, feeling an intense, burning energy flowing through my veins. The pieces were falling into place with lethal precision. I had successfully turned Cameron's biggest corporate ally into my own personal executioner. I had effectively dismantled his escape route and weaponized the very buyout he thought would make him rich. I started the engine and pulled out of the dark alley. I only had a few hours left before the sun came up on Friday. The final pieces of the puzzle involved securing my daughter's safety. I had to get Rachel out of the blast radius before the entire foundation of her life was detonated in public. I drove toward the city center, ready to orchestrate the most painful manipulation I had ever attempted. The shadow takeover was complete. Now I needed to orchestrate an evacuation. I drove back to the corporate headquarters of Gallagher Logistics long before the sun came up on Friday morning. The massive glass building was entirely empty, standing like a silent monument to the decades of blood and sweat I had poured into it. The security guards nodded respectfully as I walked through the quiet marble lobby. I took the private executive elevator up to my corner office for what I knew would be the very last time. I sat behind my heavy mahogany desk and turned on my primary computer terminal. I had only a few precious hours before the grand retirement gala preparations consumed my family completely. My most urgent priority was getting my daughter out of the immediate blast radius. When the federal authorities swarmed the country club tonight, I could not let Rachel be standing anywhere near Cameron. I needed her hundreds of miles away, safely insulated from the devastating shockwave of his arrest. I logged into the central routing network of the company. I needed to manufacture an absolute, undeniable corporate emergency. I located our largest active freight bottleneck at the primary distribution hub down in Dallas, Texas. With a few rapid keystrokes using my highest executive administrative overrides, I artificially flagged over $3 million worth of perishable pharmaceutical cargo as hopelessly stalled. I intentionally locked the routing codes and initiated an automated high-level alert that would instantly notify our most lucrative client of a catastrophic supply chain failure. It was a completely fabricated crisis, but on paper it looked like a logistical nightmare that could easily cost the company millions in penalties and ruined contracts. I picked up my office phone and dialed my daughter. Rachel answered on the third ring, her voice thick and heavy with sleep. I told her I needed her wide awake and listening carefully. I explained the massive system failure at the Dallas hub. I told her the client was actively threatening to terminate their decade-long contract and sue us for catastrophic breach of service. I instructed her to pack an overnight bag immediately and drive straight to the private corporate airfield. The company jet was already fully fueled and waiting on the tarmac to fly her directly to Texas. Rachel hesitated. Her voice instantly filled with deep confusion and mounting frustration. She reminded me that today was Friday. She reminded me that my grand retirement gala was happening tonight, and she had spent the last 3 months tirelessly helping Diane organize the high-end catering and the exclusive guest list. She vehemently suggested that Cameron should be the one to fly out to Dallas. She argued that since Cameron was the acting chief executive currently managing the daily operations, this was exactly the kind of emergency crisis he was supposed to handle. She begged me to let her stay in the city to celebrate the end of my career, to be there for my final speech. Listening to her desperately defend the man who was plotting to ruin her life tore me apart from the inside out. Every single paternal instinct I possessed wanted to soften my tone, to tell her everything was going to be all right, to protect her from the pain. But I could not afford to be a comforting father right now. I needed to be the ruthless corporate founder. I needed to use the full heavy weight of my authority one final time to force her out of the city. I hardened my voice, making it as cold and sharp as cracked ice. I told her that Cameron severely lacked the operational experience on the ground to fix a distribution bottleneck of this magnitude. I told her that she was the only person in the entire corporation who truly understood the complex routing algorithms of that specific southern facility. I raised my voice, slightly leaning into the role of the angry boss, telling her that I did not spend my entire life building this logistics empire just to watch it burn to the ground on the very day of my retirement. I demanded her absolute, unquestioning obedience. I told her to get on that plane and fix the problem before we lost our biggest client. The line went completely silent. I could literally hear the hurt in her breathing. She had never heard me speak to her with such unyielding, aggressive corporate discipline. When she finally responded, her voice was quiet, small, and trembling. She simply said she understood the severity of the situation and that she would leave for the airfield immediately. I hung up the phone, feeling a profound, sickening wave of guilt wash over my chest. I had just broken my daughter's heart to save her life. I waited in the dim light of my office, tracking the private flight status on my glowing computer screen. An hour and a half later, I watched the digital icon representing the company jet take off from the runway and bank aggressively south toward Texas. Rachel was in the air. She was completely unreachable, confined to a pressurized cabin thousands of feet above the ground. The moment the plane reached cruising altitude, I picked up my cell phone and called Wallace Reed. I told Wallace the package was airborne. The legal sniper did not waste a single second. Sitting in his downtown high-rise office, Wallace initiated the emergency financial severance protocols. He took the documents Rachel had unknowingly signed at the diner, the ones she believed were merely a boring tax loophole for my private retirement funds. Wallace filed them directly with the state financial registry. With a series of rapid, heavily encrypted digital keystrokes, Wallace legally amputated Rachel's financial identity from Cameron. He severed her name entirely from the joint marital trust, pulling her voting shares, her personal savings, and her pristine, clean credit completely out of Cameron reach. He dropped all of her assets into the impenetrable blind trust we had established the day before. He essentially built a fortress of solid titanium around her entire financial existence. Cameron illegal shadow loans were now entirely isolated. The catastrophic $8 million debt was stripped away from Rachel and anchored exclusively to Cameron's name. She was completely and totally safe. Across town at the exclusive country club, Cameron was confidently walking through the grand ballroom. He was overseeing the final arrangement of the floral centerpieces and the dramatic stage lighting for the gala tonight. He was wearing an expensive casual suit, sipping a coffee, and acting like the absolute king of the world. He pulled out his expensive smartphone to check his joint bank account. He needed to verify his available liquidity to cover a few last-minute shady expenses, including a private charter flight he had secretly booked for his escape with Diane tomorrow morning. He opened his banking application and typed in his secure passcode. The screen loaded for a brief second before flashing a stark, bright red error message. Access denied. Account not found. Cameron frowned deeply. He tapped the glass screen a few more times forcefully, trying to refresh the cellular network. The red error message remained glaring back at him. He closed the application and tried to log into his secondary wealth management portal. The exact same message appeared blocking his entry. Connection failed. Account restricted. A tiny flicker of genuine annoyance crossed his handsome face. He stared at the glowing screen, completely unaware that he was looking at the digital ashes of his stolen empire. He assumed it was just a routine banking system update, or a temporary glitch with the country club wireless network. He had a $20 million corporate buyout to close tonight. He was about to inherit an entire logistics corporation and run away with a massive fortune. He simply did not have the time or the patience to deal with a minor technological inconvenience. Cameron shoved the phone carelessly back into his pocket. He turned his attention back to the grand stage where the microphones were currently being tested for the evening speeches. He smiled confidently at the busy event coordinator, smoothing the lapels of his suit. He thought he was completely untouchable. He had absolutely no idea that his wife was safely out of state. His financial safety nets were completely eradicated, and the man he was planning to bury was currently sitting in a downtown office, wrapping a federal noose tightly around his neck. The hours ticked away relentlessly. The trap was firmly locked. It was finally time to go to the party. The heavy oak doors of the country club swung open to reveal a scene of absolute opulent perfection. It was Friday evening, and the grand ballroom was completely packed with 200 of the most influential people in the state. I handed my overcoat to the attendant and stepped into the softly lit foyer, keeping my shoulders slightly hunched and my breathing deliberately shallow. I had to maintain the illusion of the dying patriarch for just a little while longer. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume roasted meats and the crisp notes of chilled champagne. A live string quartet played a sophisticated classical melody in the corner, providing an elegant soundtrack to my impending murder. I walked slowly down the carpeted hallway, observing the crowd through the open archways. The room was a sea of tailored tuxedos and designer evening gowns. I saw state senators shaking hands with supply chain executives. I saw local politicians laughing with the very corporate rivals I had spent decades crushing in the open market. They had all come to pay their respects on the night of my official retirement. But I knew the actual truth. They had not come to celebrate my legacy. They had been invited to witness my highly publicized corporate funeral. I paused near a massive pillar of white marble, catching my breath. I looked at the sheer scale of the event surrounding me. Towering ice sculptures carved into the shape of cargo ships dominated the buffet tables. Cascading arrangements of rare white orchids hung from the crystal chandeliers. Waiters in pristine white gloves circulated continuously, carrying silver trays loaded with caviar and imported wines. The staggering cost of this single evening easily exceeded $250,000. A cold, sickening realization washed over me as I calculated the expenses. Diane had never possessed her own source of independent wealth. She had never worked a day in the corporate sector. Every single extravagant detail in this room had been meticulously purchased using the stolen funds drained from my corporate logistics accounts. She was not throwing me a retirement gala. She was throwing her own victory party. She was forcing me to physically attend the celebration of my own execution, entirely funded by the money I had bled for 40 years to earn. I looked across the crowded ballroom and spotted my wife holding court near the main stage. Diane was putting on the absolute performance of a lifetime. She wore a stunning black evening gown that managed to look both incredibly expensive and respectfully mournful. She was speaking to a group of influential investors, pressing a delicate silk handkerchief to her eyes. I watched her nod sadly, placing a hand over her heart, accepting their deep condolences about my rapidly declining health. She was playing the tragic, devoted caregiver with such flawless emotional precision. She was laying the psychological groundwork so that when my heart inevitably stopped beating later tonight, everyone in the room would view it as a tragic but expected medical inevitability. A few feet away from her, Cameron was working the room like a seasoned politician. He moved through the crowd of wealthy venture capitalists with a wide, confident smile, shaking hands and slapping shoulders. He looked like the absolute portrait of a capable, dynamic young successor, ready to take the reins of a massive logistics empire. He was selling them the illusion of a smooth, seamless transition. He had absolutely no idea that the real transition happening tonight would end with him being dragged out of the country club in federal handcuffs. I stepped back into the quiet shadows of the private coat room adjacent to the main ballroom. I needed a moment of silence to center myself before stepping into the spotlight. The room was dimly lit, filled with rows of expensive winter coats and the faint smell of leather. I stood behind a row of heavy cashmere overcoats completely hidden from view. The side door of the coat room opened quietly. I held my breath entirely. Diane walked into the room carrying 2 crystal champagne flutes. She placed the glasses gently on a small polished side table near the mirror. She did not know I was standing less than 5 feet away, cloaked in the shadows. I watched her open her small silver clutch purse. Her manicured fingers reached inside and pulled out a tiny plastic vial. My heart hammered a slow, powerful rhythm against my ribs. I watched her unscrew the cap of the vial. She poured a fine white powder directly into one of the champagne glasses. It was the crushed synthetic heart medication. It was the final lethal dose. She took a small silver stirring spoon from the table and mixed the liquid carefully, watching the powder dissolve completely into the bubbling golden alcohol until it was absolutely invisible. She was preparing the final poison pill she intended to hand me right before I walked onto the stage. She wanted the chemical to hit my bloodstream just as the speeches began, ensuring I collapsed in front of 200 witnesses. Diane picked up the 2 glasses, her face completely devoid of any emotion. It was the face of a woman executing a financial transaction. She turned toward the doorway, ready to walk out and find me in the crowd. But right at that exact second, the coat room door swung open again. It was a loud, boisterous politician who had enjoyed far too much free wine. He enthusiastically greeted Diane, complimenting her dress and loudly asking where her wonderful husband was hiding. Diane was forced to turn her back to the side table to politely engage the wealthy guest. She held the clean glass in her left hand and kept the poisoned glass resting on the table behind her. She plastered her tragic fake smile back onto her face, engaging the politician in a conversation about my terrible fatigue. This was my window. I had exactly 5 seconds before he walked away. I moved silently out from behind the heavy cashmere coats. My footsteps made absolutely no sound on the thick, plush carpet. I reached the side table just as a passing waiter walked through the service hallway adjacent to the coat room, carrying a tray of freshly poured champagne. I reached out and swiftly lifted the poisoned glass from the polished table. In the exact same smooth, uninterrupted motion, I grabbed a clean, identical crystal flute from the waiter tray and placed it precisely where the tainted glass had been. The waiter kept walking, completely oblivious to the exchange. I stepped back into the deep shadows, holding the poisoned glass securely in my hand. I watched Diane finish her conversation. She turned around, picked up the clean glass from the table, and walked out into the grand ballroom, completely unaware that she was now carrying harmless alcohol. I stood alone in the quiet coat room, staring at the deadly liquid in my hand. I walked over to the large potted fern sitting in the corner of the room. I tilted the glass and poured the poisoned champagne directly into the dark soil, watching the lethal bubbles disappear into the earth. I placed the empty crystal flute on a nearby shelf. I took a deep cleansing breath. The exhaustion, the feigned weakness, the trembling posture, I stripped it all away. I rolled my shoulders back, pulling my spine completely straight. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored suit and ran a hand through my hair. I felt a massive surge of predatory energy flood my veins. The sick old man they thought they were dealing with was officially dead. I walked out of the shadows of the coat room. I signaled a passing waiter and picked up a fresh, clean glass of champagne from his silver tray. I turned toward the massive double doors of the grand ballroom. The string quartet was reaching the crescendo of their melody. The crowd was buzzing with the sounds of corporate gossip and high society laughter. I pushed the heavy oak doors open wide and stepped directly into the brilliant, blinding light of the crystal chandeliers. I walked straight into the center of the ballroom, holding my glass high, perfectly healthy, perfectly composed. I caught Diane's eyes across the room. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second when she saw me standing tall and strong. She thought I was walking to my grave. She had absolutely no idea I was walking to her execution. The game was finally over. The trap was permanently set. It was time to pull the lever. The grand ballroom fell into a hushed and respectful silence as the heavy velvet curtains near the main stage were drawn back. A single bright spotlight cut through the dim ambiance, illuminating the polished wooden podium. Cameron strode confidently across the stage. He adjusted his tailored jacket and gripped the edges of the podium, projecting the ultimate image of a solemn and burdened leader. He looked out over the sea of wealthy investors and politicians with an expression of profound sorrow, perfectly crafted for the occasion. The string quartet stopped playing, letting a heavy, manufactured gravity settle over the room. I stood near the back of the room, holding my glass of clean champagne, watching my son-in-law prepare to deliver my eulogy to a crowd of living, breathing vultures. Cameron leaned into the microphone, and his voice echoed clearly through the massive speakers. He thanked everyone for coming to what he described as the most bittersweet evening of his entire life. He told the crowd that they were gathered here not just to celebrate a corporate milestone, but to honor a titan of the logistics industry. His voice cracked slightly on the word titan. It was a masterful piece of theatrical manipulation. He spoke about my relentless work ethic, my decades of sacrifice, and the incredible empire I had built from nothing but a single delivery truck. To anyone who did not know the absolute truth, he sounded like a deeply devoted heir, paying tribute to his failing mentor. To me, he sounded like a grave robber delivering a speech over the tomb he had just dug. The hypocrisy of his words was physically nauseating. Cameron lowered his gaze and let out a long, trembling sigh. He told the room that over the past few months, my health had taken a sudden and devastating turn. He described my fabricated condition as a tragic, rapid decline, telling the guests that the brilliant mind and strong body they all respected were finally surrendering to the cruel passage of time. He painted a picture of a man who was no longer capable of leading, who was exhausted and fading away into the shadows. He was setting the narrative in stone, ensuring that when the poison Diane had supposedly administered finally stopped, my heart later tonight, every single person in this room would believe it was a natural mercy. I scanned the faces of the crowd as Cameron spun his web of lies. These were the corporate elites, the venture capitalists and the politicians I had done business with for 4 decades. They were nodding sympathetically, whispering to one another, holding their expensive drinks. They had all come here to watch the old lion finally fall. They wanted to witness the exact moment the crown was passed to the younger generation. They were predators waiting to see how they could profit from my departure. Not a single person in that massive crowd knew that the man they were mourning was currently standing in the back of the room, possessing enough legal and financial ammunition to destroy the very foundation of the event. Cameron shifted the focus of his speech, redirecting the spotlight to the front table. He asked the crowd to direct their attention to my loving wife, Diane. He praised her with a sickening level of adoration, calling her an angel of mercy and a pillar of absolute strength. He told the investors that Diane had sacrificed her own happiness to become my unwavering full-time caregiver. He praised her endless patience and her selfless devotion, telling everyone that she had stayed by my side through my darkest hours. The room erupted into polite, supportive applause. Diane stood up from her seat at the head table, dabbing the corners of her eyes with a silk handkerchief. She offered a modest, trembling smile to the crowd, playing the role of the exhausted, tragic heroine to absolute perfection. She was soaking in their sympathy, completely unaware that her own criminal execution was merely minutes away. I watched her accept their applause, and I felt nothing but cold, detached observation. The woman I had loved and protected for 38 years had planned my murder to fund her lifestyle with another man. She was standing there accepting praise for slowly poisoning my morning coffee. The sheer audacity of her performance cemented my resolve. There would be absolutely no mercy tonight. Cameron raised his hands to quiet the applause. He leaned back into the microphone, and his tone shifted from sorrowful to commanding. He announced that tonight was about securing the future. He stated that in order to protect my legacy and ensure the survival of Gallagher Logistics, I had made the difficult but necessary decision to completely step away from the company. He told the room that tonight, right here on this stage, I would officially sign over the final executive control and authorize the transition of my empire. He proudly announced that the transition involved a massive corporate partnership. He gestured toward the front row, acknowledging Malcolm Stanton, the chief executive of Apex Dynamics. Malcolm raised his glass in a silent toast, playing his part in my shadow operation perfectly. Cameron believed Malcolm was here to finalize the $20 million fraudulent buyout. Cameron thought he was minutes away from becoming a very rich man. The crowd began to applaud again, expecting the grand finale of the evening. Cameron looked out across the room, and his eyes searched the crowd until they locked onto me, standing near the back doors. He offered a sad, encouraging smile. He spoke directly into the microphone, calling my name and asking me to join him on the stage. He asked the room to give a warm, standing ovation to the founder of the company. 200 people turned around to look at me. They began to clap softly, parting like the sea, to create a clear path down the center aisle. I did not stumble. I did not slouch my shoulders. I stood perfectly straight and began to walk down the long carpeted aisle toward the brilliantly lit stage. Every single step I took was measured and powerful. I did not look like a dying man surrendering his crown. I looked like a predator entering his own territory. The murmurs in the crowd slowly faded as people noticed the distinct change in my posture. The fragile old man they expected to see shuffling toward the podium was nowhere to be found. The applause grew slightly hesitant, slightly confused. I reached the base of the stage and walked up the wooden stairs. Cameron extended his hand to help me up, but I completely ignored him. I walked past his outstretched hand and moved directly toward the podium. Diane stepped forward from her seat at the front table. She climbed the side stairs and approached me holding a sleek leather folder and an expensive gold fountain pen. This was the moment she had been waiting for months. This was the culmination of all her lies and all her poison. She stood next to me on the stage, completely oblivious to the fact that I was fully aware of her betrayal. She offered me a soft, trembling smile designed for the audience. She opened the leather folder, revealing the final escrow release documents that would authorize the fraudulent transfer of $20 million to their offshore accounts. She pressed the gold pen into my hand. She leaned in close to me, ensuring her voice was only loud enough for me to hear. She gently placed her hand on my arm and whispered that it was time to rest now, darling. I looked down at the forged documents and the gold pen in my hand. I looked at Cameron standing to my right, waiting eagerly for his massive payday. I looked at Diane standing to my left, waiting for my heart to stop beating. Then I looked out at the 200 guests, waiting in absolute silence for the old king to abdicate his throne. I slowly placed the gold pen down on the polished wooden podium. I did not sign a single letter. I reached out and took the microphone directly from the stand, gripping the cold metal tightly in my hand. I tapped the top of the microphone twice. The sharp, percussive sounds echoed like gunshots through the massive ballroom speakers, commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. I turned my head and looked directly into Diane's eyes, watching the confident smile begin to slip from her face. I brought the microphone to my lips. I told her that rest is for the dead, Diane, and I am feeling surprisingly alive. Vincent's words hung in the stale, conditioned air of the grand ballroom. Diane stared at him. The fake, tragic smile on her face froze, then slowly crumbled like cracking porcelain. Her eyes widened, searching his face frantically for the weakness, the fatigue, the imminent collapse she had been counting on all week. She found absolutely nothing but cold, hard resolve. Vincent did not reach for the expensive gold pen she had pressed into his palm. He deliberately placed his hands flat on the polished wooden podium, anchoring himself as the absolute, unquestioned authority in the room. Cameron stood a few feet away, his confident, triumphant posture suddenly going rigid. He shifted his weight nervously, glancing down at the forged escrow documents resting on the stand. He opened his mouth to speak, likely planning to pass off Vincent's words as a morbid joke or a tragic symptom of his supposed dementia, but Vincent did not give him the chance to spin another lie. Vincent turned his gaze toward the back of the massive ballroom, looking straight past the sea of wealthy investors and stunned politicians. He found the sound and lighting booth elevated above the dense crowd. Sitting at the main control board was not the country club usual teenage technician, but a broad-shouldered man dressed in a sharp black suit. It was one of Wallace Reed's private operatives, meticulously planted there hours before the gala even began. Vincent gave the man a single, barely perceptible nod. The operative did his job flawlessly. He did not simply press play on the audio file. He killed all other noise in the room first. The ambient background music was cut abruptly, leaving a sudden vacuum of sound. The soft golden spotlight focused on the stage, widened, bathing Diane and Cameron in a harsh, unforgiving white glare. The sudden absolute silence in the massive luxury ballroom was truly deafening. 200 high society guests stopped their hushed conversations mid-sentence. They turned their attention entirely to the stage, sensing that the predictable script of the evening had just been torn to pieces. Then a low, heavy crackle of static hissed through the towering concert speakers surrounding the perimeter of the room. It was followed immediately by the undeniable, crystal-clear sound of a heavy, insulated door clicking shut. And then came Cameron's voice. It was not the polished, respectful tone he had used moments ago to deliver his tear-jerking speech. It was the frantic, hushed, venomous whisper of a conspirator. "Did you up his dosage this morning?" The words boomed through the entire country club, bouncing off the high, vaulted ceilings and the expensive crystal chandeliers. The audio quality was absolutely pristine, capturing the hollow acoustic echo of the flower shop walk in cooler with terrifying perfection. The wealthy guests sitting in the front row physically recoiled in their seats. A few seasoned venture capitalists exchanged bewildered, horrified glances. Up on the stage, Cameron turned the color of wet ash. He took a clumsy, stumbling step backward, his mouth opening in silent terror as his own recorded voice continued to broadcast his darkest crimes to the entire city. "The buyout happens Friday, Diane. If his heart does not stop by the retirement gala, we lose the offshore transfer." The recorded voice of my ambitious son-in-law echoed with undeniable clarity. Every single syllable was another nail hammered deep into his coffin. But the true devastation came next. Diane's voice, smooth, cold, and entirely devoid of any human empathy, poured out of the massive speakers. I doubled it in his coffee. The old fool suspects nothing. The sound of her recorded laughter, that light melodic chuckle she had used to deceive me and everyone else for decades, filled the ballroom. It sounded demonic against the backdrop of the opulent retirement party she had personally paid for using stolen corporate funds. The entire ballroom completely paralyzed. The constant ambient clinking of crystal champagne glasses ceased entirely. Nobody moved a single muscle. Nobody dared to breathe. The wealthy elite of the city people who normally thrived on cutthroat corporate ruthlessness and public scandal were completely frozen by the sheer naked depravity echoing all around them. They were staring directly at a woman who had just been publicly unmasked as a ruthless attempted murderer. Diane stood frozen next to the podium. Her meticulously manicured fingers began to tremble so violently that the delicate champagne flute she was holding slipped right from her grasp. The heavy crystal glass hit the polished hardwood floor of the stage. The sound of it shattering into 100 sharp pieces broke the terrible, suffocating silence in the room, like a gunshot. The golden, bubbling liquid spilled across the polished wood, soaking slowly into the delicate hem of her expensive black evening gown. She did not even look down at the mess. Her wide, panicked eyes were locked entirely onto Vincent, filled with a primal, absolute terror. She finally realized that the man she thought she was leading blindly to the slaughterhouse had actually built the very gallows she was currently standing on. Cameron broke first. The carefully crafted illusion of the capable dynamic successor completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a desperate, cornered animal. He realized with terrifying clarity that his entire life, his freedom, his carefully built reputation, and his stolen millions were evaporating into thin air. He spun around wildly, his eyes frantically searching the room until they locked onto the soundboard at the back of the ballroom. He desperately thought if he could just cut the audio, he could somehow stop the nightmare from unfolding. He lunged forward, scrambling carelessly off the side of the stage. He shoved violently past a table of startled investors, knocking over an expensive centerpiece of white orchids as he sprinted down the center aisle toward the control booth. He was shouting wildly for someone to turn off the speakers, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. He did not make it more than 20 feet down the carpeted aisle. Wallace Reed had anticipated every single desperate movement. As Cameron sprinted through the crowd, 4 massive men in identical dark suits stepped out seamlessly from the shadows near the coat room and the emergency exits. They were Wallace Private Security Team, highly trained professionals who moved with terrifying coordinated precision. They stepped directly into Cameron's path, forming an impenetrable solid human wall of muscle and tailored wool. Cameron slammed hard into the lead security officer, expecting the man to move out of his way. The officer did not budge a single inch. He firmly grabbed Cameron by the shoulders and shoved him backward with enough sheer force to send him stumbling backward onto the carpet. Cameron fell hard to his knees, gasping for air, looking up at the 4 massive men silently surrounding him. The lead officer simply crossed his thick arms and stared down at him, ensuring Cameron understood clearly that he was not leaving this room until Vincent was entirely finished with him. The audio recording finally ended, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. The 200 guests remained absolutely motionless, their eyes darting rapidly between Cameron on his knees in the aisle, the intimidating security guards surrounding him, and Diane trembling visibly on the stage. Vincent remained completely still at the podium. He did not smile. He did not yell. He simply looked down at his wife, watching the heavy reality of her total destruction wash completely over her pale, terrified face. He looked at the forged escrow documents resting on the wooden stand, the expensive papers that were supposed to be his absolute death warrant. He slowly reached out and deliberately pushed the heavy leather folder off the podium, letting it fall to the floor, landing right next to the shattered crystal glass. He wrapped his strong hand around the microphone one final time. He looked out over the massive crowd of paralyzed investors, politicians, and stunned corporate rivals. His voice was calm, steady, and utterly devoid of any mercy. As you can hear, he said his words slicing deeply through the heavy silence of the ballroom. My wife and son-in-law have been very busy planning my funeral. The grand ballroom was perfectly paralyzed, suspended in a terrifying collective gasp. I stood at the podium looking down at the shattered crystal and the spilled champagne. Cameron scrambled up from the carpeted aisle where Wallace's private security team had thrown him. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, his breathing ragged and frantic. He looked frantically toward the main double doors, but the four massive men in dark suits had already moved to block the primary exit. The heavy brass handles were secured. Nobody was leaving. Cameron spun around, desperately looking for a way out. He scrambled back toward the front of the room, drawn to the stage where the forged escrow documents still lay scattered on the hardwood floor. He thought he still had a piece of leverage. He thought the $20 million deal could somehow save him. Malcolm Stanton rose slowly from his seat in the front row. The massive silver-bearded chief executive of Apex Dynamics buttoned his tuxedo jacket with deliberate, methodical precision. He did not look like a man whose corporate buyout had just been derailed. He looked like a man executing a flawless business maneuver. He walked up the wooden side stairs and stepped onto the stage, intercepting Cameron right next to the podium. Cameron looked at Malcolm with wild, desperate eyes. He tried to speak, trying to salvage the fraudulent deal, pleading that this was just a family misunderstanding and that the logistics fleet was still ready to be transferred. He reached out to shake Malcolm's hand. Malcolm did not extend his hand. Instead, he reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick, bound legal document. He slapped the heavy stack of papers forcefully against Cameron's chest, forcing the younger man to grab them instinctively. Malcolm's voice was a low, dangerous rumble that carried perfectly across the silent ballroom without needing a microphone. He told Cameron that Apex Dynamics was not in the business of buying stolen property. He explained that those papers were not an escrow release. They were a formal federal lawsuit. Malcolm stated clearly that Cameron had deliberately attempted to sell corporate assets he did not legally own using forged signatures to defraud a major logistics corporation. Malcolm informed him that his legal team had already filed the paperwork with the Federal Prosecutor Office for criminal wire fraud and corporate espionage. Cameron stared down at the lawsuit in his trembling hands. The color drained entirely from his face as the crushing reality of his situation set in. He was not walking away with a $20 million empire. He was walking away as the primary defendant in a massive federal fraud case brought by the most ruthless corporate entity in the state. While Cameron was suffocating under the weight of Malcolm's legal strike, another figure stepped out of the shadows. Wallace Reed, my razor-sharp corporate attorney, glided onto the stage with the silent, lethal grace of a predator. He completely ignored the gasping crowd and the shattered glass. He walked directly toward Diane, who was still trembling violently near the center of the stage. Diane looked at Wallace with wide, panicked eyes. She tried to step backward, but the heavy folds of her expensive black evening gown caught on her heels, trapping her in place. Wallace did not offer a polite greeting. He extended his arm and handed her a crisp, white envelope sealed with a thick, red legal ribbon. He spoke in a crisp, authoritative tone, ensuring that the politicians and high society elites in the front row heard every single devastating word. Wallace informed Diane that she had just been served with emergency divorce proceedings. He explained that the documents completely stripped her of all marital assets, properties, and financial support, effective immediately. Diane began to sob hysterically, shaking her head and stammering that I could not leave her with nothing after 38 years of marriage. She cried out that she was legally entitled to half of everything I owned. Wallace smiled a cold, shark-like smile. He leaned in slightly closer to her and delivered the final, fatal blow to her grand illusion. He explained a very specific, obscure piece of state law known as the Slayer Statute. It was a strict legal provision designed to prevent criminals from profiting from their own heinous actions. Wallace stated clearly that when a spouse actively attempts to murder their partner, all legal claims to shared wealth, inheritance, and alimony are instantly and permanently revoked. He pointed down at the spilled champagne soaking into the floorboards. He told her that the poison she had mixed into that glass was not just a weapon of murder. It was her absolute financial ruin. Because I had survived, and because I had the toxicology reports and the audio recordings to prove her murderous intent, she was legally entitled to absolutely nothing. She would leave this country club with the clothes on her back and a fast-track ticket to a federal penitentiary. Diane collapsed to her knees on the stage, burying her face in her hands, letting out a loud, gut-wrenching wail of pure despair. The opulent life she had murdered for was completely gone. She was entirely penniless, stripped of her dignity, her wealth, and her freedom in front of the entire city. Cameron watched Diane fall to the floor. The last shred of his fabricated composure completely shattered. He realized that the physical doors were barricaded. He realized his corporate shield was gone. But he still believed he had one final desperate escape hatch. He remembered the shadow loans he had illegally taken out using my daughter Rachel's name. He thought if he could just access his phone and transfer the remaining liquid cash from those toxic loans into his offshore holding company, he could somehow ease his way out of the country before the authorities closed in. Cameron frantically dug into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out his expensive smartphone. His hands were shaking so violently he dropped the device once before managing to unlock the screen. He opened his encrypted banking application, praying to see the millions of dollars he had stolen. I watched him tap the glass screen, his eyes wide with manic hope. And then I watched that hope instantly turn to absolute, unspeakable terror. The application did not show millions of dollars. It showed a glaring red error message indicating that the offshore account had been permanently seized by federal banking authorities. He frantically swiped the screen, opening his domestic joint accounts, the ones he had shared with my daughter. He stared at the balance. It read 0. I stepped away from the podium and walked slowly toward him. I looked down at his trembling hands, clutching the useless phone. I told him that my daughter was currently thousands of miles away, flying safely on a private corporate jet. I told him that while he was busy picking out floral arrangements for my funeral, Wallace and I had legally severed Rachel's name from every single one of his accounts. We had locked her assets behind an impenetrable blind trust. Cameron stared at me, his breath coming in short, rapid gasps. He realized that the millions of dollars in toxic, illegal debt he had tried to pin on my daughter were now anchored exclusively to his own name. The shadow lenders would not go after Rachel. They would come directly for him. He was completely trapped. He had no money to hire a defense attorney. He had no offshore funds to fund his escape. He was deeply in debt to dangerous men, and he was currently standing on a brilliantly lit stage surrounded by angry investors, a rival executive suing him for fraud, and private security blocking every possible exit. The brilliant, ambitious successor was exposed to the entire world as nothing more than a desperate, penniless criminal waiting for the final curtain to fall. I stood tall, looking out over the silent, terrified crowd of high society elites. They had come to watch me fade away into the shadows. Instead, they were witnessing the absolute annihilation of the parasites who had tried to bury me. The financial execution was completely flawless, leaving no survivors and no escape. The trap had snapped entirely shut. Now all that remained was for the authorities to carry away the wreckage. The heavy silence in the grand ballroom was shattered by a sound that completely destroyed the elegant atmosphere. The piercing wail of police sirens echoed from the long driveway of the country club, growing louder and more aggressive by the second. Red and blue lights began to flash violently through the tall glass windows, casting frantic, colorful shadows across the pale faces of the wealthy guests. The 200 investors and politicians who had been paralyzed by the audio recording now began to step backward, clearing a wide path toward the main entrance. They knew instinctively that the final act of this tragedy was about to unfold. The massive double doors of the ballroom swung open with a tremendous amount of force. A dozen uniformed local police officers marched into the room, moving with swift tactical precision. Right behind them walked 4 federal agents wearing dark suits and stern, unyielding expressions. They did not pause to look at the ice sculptures or the crystal chandeliers. They moved in a direct, straight line down the center aisle, heading straight for the brightly lit stage, where the remnants of my family stood completely frozen in terror. Diane let out a sharp, trembling gasp. She took a clumsy step backward, her high heels slipping on the spilled champagne, but there was absolutely nowhere left to run. 2 female federal agents stepped onto the wooden stage and moved directly toward her. They did not offer a polite greeting. One agent firmly grabbed Diane by the arms, pinning them behind her back, while the other agent immediately snatched the small silver clutch purse that Diane was desperately clutching to her side. Diane began to stammer wildly, claiming that they had no right to search her property without a warrant. The federal agent simply ignored her. She unclasped the silver purse right there on the stage and emptied its contents onto the polished wooden podium. A tube of expensive lipstick fell out alongside a compact mirror and a set of car keys. But the agents were not looking for makeup. They were looking for the tiny, clear plastic vial filled with a fine white powder. The agent picked up the vial and held it up to the light. It was the remaining crushed synthetic heart medication. It was the exact same poison Diane had poured into my morning coffee, and the exact same lethal substance she had attempted to slip into my champagne glass just 20 minutes ago. Diane's face morphed into a mask of pure, unfiltered panic. She looked out at the crowd, and then looked frantically at me, begging me to tell the authorities that it was just a simple misunderstanding. She claimed it was just her personal anxiety medication. She pleaded with me to make them stop. I walked slowly toward her, stopping just a few feet away. I looked into her terrified eyes and told her the absolute truth. I told her that she was not dealing with a sudden surprise inspection. I explained that I had walked into the local police precinct early Thursday morning, carrying a certified medical toxicology report from an independent clinic. I told her that the doctors had found lethal levels of the heart medication in my bloodstream, and they had legally documented the attempted homicide days ago. Cameron, who was still surrounded by Wallace's private security team at the bottom of the stage, looked up at me in complete disbelief. He asked why the police had not arrested them on Thursday if they already had the medical proof. His voice shook with a mixture of confusion and absolute dread. I looked down at the young man who had tried to steal my empire. I told him that an attempted murder charge would have certainly put Diane in a state prison, but it might not have been enough to permanently destroy him. I told him that if the police had knocked on our door on Thursday, he would have simply hired expensive defense lawyers and claimed he knew absolutely nothing about the poisoned coffee. He would have distanced himself from Diane and walked away with a slap on the wrist while quietly dissolving the fraudulent corporate buyout. I explained that the federal authorities and I wanted a much bigger prize. We wanted to catch him committing an undeniable, massive financial crime. We needed him to actively attempt the $20 million wire transfer across state lines using the forged documents. By allowing him to bring the fake escrow release to the country club tonight, and by letting him attempt to execute the fraudulent corporate sale in front of 200 witnesses, we had successfully triggered federal jurisdiction. We did not just want an attempted murder charge. We wanted criminal wire fraud, corporate espionage, and a federal conspiracy that carried mandatory minimum sentences spanning decades. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly, echoing across the silent ballroom, as the officers secured Diane's wrists behind her back. The sharp metallic sound was the final trigger that completely broke the fragile criminal alliance between my wife and my son-in-law. The illusion of their passionate, unstoppable romance evaporated, instantly replaced by the raw, vicious instinct to survive. Diane twisted violently against the federal agents, screaming at the top of her lungs. She pointed her manicured finger directly at Cameron, her voice cracking with pure venom. She shouted to the entire room that none of this was her idea. She screamed that Cameron was the one who had planned the corporate takeover, that Cameron was the one who had forged the signature on the escrow documents, and that Cameron was the one who had manipulated her into participating in the scheme. She wailed that she was just a vulnerable woman who had been coerced by a greedy, manipulative young man. Cameron's face contorted into a mask of absolute hatred. He struggled against the security guards holding him down, his voice rising to a frantic, desperate roar. He shouted back at Diane, calling her a greedy, pathetic liar. He screamed to the federal agents that Diane was the one who had researched the untraceable heart medication. He yelled that Diane was the one who had physically purchased the poison, and that she was the one who had poured it into my cup every single morning. He told the entire ballroom that she had been begging him for months to speed up the corporate buyout so they could run away with the cash. The 200 high society guests watched the spectacle in absolute disgust. The politicians, the venture capitalists, and the corporate executives simply stared in stunned silence as the elegant, devoted wife and the brilliant, ambitious successor tore each other to pieces like rabid animals. They exposed every single dirty secret, every illegal transaction, and every murderous intent loudly and publicly in front of the entire city. They were doing the prosecutor job for him, confessing to multiple federal crimes in their desperate, pathetic attempts to save themselves. The federal agents did not try to stop the screaming match. They simply let them talk quietly, recording every single admission of guilt. Finally, the lead agent gave a sharp nod. The officers firmly grabbed Diane and Cameron by their arms and began to physically drag them away from the stage. I stood motionless at the podium and watched the long walk of shame. Diane stumbled in her expensive evening gown, her mascara running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She wept and pleaded to the guests as she passed them, but the wealthy crowd simply turned their backs, stepping away from her, as if she carried a contagious disease. Cameron fought against the officers, pulling him down the center aisle, his head hanging low, stripped of every ounce of his fabricated pride. The brilliant corporate prodigy was leaving the country club as a penniless, humiliated criminal. The heavy wooden doors of the ballroom slammed shut behind them, cutting off the sounds of their screaming. The flashing red and blue lights faded as the police cruisers pulled away from the country club, heading directly toward the federal holding facility downtown. The air in the room suddenly felt lighter, cleaner, as if a toxic cloud had finally been completely eradicated. The financial and personal execution was absolute. The parasites had been surgically, permanently removed. I took a deep, steady breath, looking out at the silent, empty space they had left behind, knowing that my empire, my daughter, and my life were finally completely safe. 6 months have passed since the night the grand ballroom became a federal crime scene. I am sitting quietly in the small back room of Maria Floral Shop. The scent of damp earth and blooming white hydrangeas fills the air exactly as it did on that terrible birthday morning. But today, the air feels incredibly light. I am holding a simple paper cup of regular black coffee. There are no hidden synthetic chemicals in this cup. There is no bitter almond taste of betrayal. There is only the rich, warm comfort of a new beginning. I take a long, slow sip and look out the large front window, watching the morning city traffic move down the busy street. The heavy, crushing fatigue that anchored me to the floor for an entire year is completely gone. I feel strong. I feel alert. I feel like a man who stared directly into the abyss and forced the abyss to blink first. The aftermath of the retirement gala was swift and absolutely merciless. The federal justice system does not entertain tearful apologies or fabricated stories of domestic misunderstanding. Diane tried everything to save herself. She hired a team of expensive defense attorneys using the last remnants of her personal savings. She sat in the courtroom week after week wearing conservative gray suits, crying softly for the jury and claiming she was a victim of Cameron manipulation. But the audio recordings, the pristine security footage from the urgent care clinic, and the testimony of the document forger painted a very different picture. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. The judge showed zero leniency for a woman who slowly poisoned her husband of 38 years for a payout. Diane is currently serving a 15-year sentence in a maximum security state penitentiary for attempted murder. She traded a life of luxury charity galas and tailored silk blouses for a concrete cell and a bright orange uniform. The woman who despised domestic chores now spends her days working in the prison laundry facility. Cameron's fate was even more devastating because he fell from a much greater height. He actually believed he was the smartest man in any room he entered. He thought he was a corporate prodigy, untouchable and destined for greatness. The federal prosecutors completely dismantled that illusion. They hit him with a mountain of undeniable evidence: corporate espionage, wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit murder. His attempts to throw Diane under the bus only resulted in the prosecutors adding perjury to his long list of charges. When the rival chief executive Malcolm Stanton took the stand and testified about the fraudulent buyout offer, Cameron's entire defense completely collapsed. The ambitious young successor is now serving a 20-year sentence in a federal correctional institution. He has no money. He has no influence. The dangerous shadow lenders he borrowed millions from are still waiting patiently for him to be released. He will spend the next 2 decades trapped in a small metal cage, knowing that he threw away a golden empire because he was too greedy to wait his turn. The most beautiful victory of this entire ordeal, however, belongs to my daughter Rachel. When she landed in Texas that Friday evening and discovered the supply chain crisis was a complete fabrication, she was furious. But when she received my phone call the next morning, explaining exactly why I had forced her out of the city, that anger turned into absolute heartbreak. Discovering that your husband and your mother were plotting to murder your father is a trauma that would break most people. But Rachel is my daughter. She possesses the same resilient steel in her spine that I do. She did not crumble. She returned to the city and immediately filed for a ruthless, unyielding divorce. Because Wallace Reed had already legally severed her assets and locked them in a blind trust, Cameron could not touch a single penny of her wealth during the divorce proceedings. She walked away completely financially untouched. More importantly, Rachel stepped into the massive vacuum left by Cameron's arrest. She took over the daily operations of Gallagher Logistics with a fierce, incredible focus. She fired the lazy executives Cameron had hired. She renegotiated our biggest contracts. She proved to the entire board of directors that she did not need a husband to lead an empire. She is now the official chief executive officer, running the company with more efficiency and profitability than I ever did. I watch her command boardroom meetings, and I feel a profound, overwhelming sense of pride. I did not just save her life. I cleared the path for her to become the absolute powerhouse she was always meant to be. I sit in the quiet flower shop, watching the morning sun illuminate the colorful displays, and I reflect on the true nature of family and greed. For decades, I believed that providing endless financial comfort was the ultimate expression of love. I thought handing Cameron the keys to my company would make him loyal. I thought giving Diane unlimited access to my wealth would make her happy. But money without boundaries does not breed loyalty. It breeds entitlement. It creates parasites who look at your generosity and only wonder why you are not giving them more. I think about how easy it would have been to just drink that coffee, to simply close my eyes and let the darkness take me, believing I was surrounded by a loving wife and a capable successor. But the truth is a harsh and blinding light. It burns away the comforting illusions we build around ourselves. I had to face the terrifying reality that the 2 people closest to me viewed my existence as a temporary inconvenience. They underestimated my intelligence, and they severely underestimated my will to survive. They forgot that you do not build a massive corporate empire by being soft. You build it by knowing exactly when to strike. I survived their assassination attempt because I remembered the gritty, ruthless survivor I used to be. I did not scream. I did not beg. I surgically removed the infection from my life and secured my family legacy. The bell above the shop door chimes, gently pulling me from my thoughts. Maria finishes tending to a fresh delivery of yellow roses and wipes her hands on her green canvas apron. She walks over to the small table where I am sitting. She offers me a warm, genuine smile. It is a smile built on mutual respect and quiet understanding. There is no hidden agenda in her eyes. There is no calculation. I reach inside my tailored suit jacket and pull out a thick manila envelope. I place it carefully on the table and slide it across the smooth surface toward her. Maria looks at the envelope, her brow furrowing in slight confusion. She asks me what it is. I tell her it is a small token of my immense gratitude. I tell her that on the darkest day of my entire life she did not turn a blind eye. She risked her own safety to pull me into the shadows and warn me. I instruct her to open it. Maria slowly breaks the seal and pulls out the crisp legal documents inside. She reads the heavy embossed text, and her hands immediately begin to tremble. Tears well up in her kind eyes, spilling over her cheeks as she realizes exactly what she is holding. It is the original commercial deed to the entire building that houses her flower shop. The mortgage has been paid in full. The property belongs entirely to her, free and clear forever. She tries to hand it back, stammering that she cannot possibly accept something so massive. I gently push the documents back toward her. I tell her that she gave me the opportunity to save my own life, and that this is simply the cost of doing good business with an old friend. She covers her mouth with her hands, weeping quietly, with pure, unadulterated joy. I stand up from the small table, adjusting my coat. I take one last look at the bright, beautiful shop. It is a quiet, satisfying victory for an underestimated patriarch. I walk out the front door, stepping into the warm morning sunlight, breathing the fresh, clean air of a brand new day. I proved that true power never begs for respect. It enforces it. The most profound lesson from this ordeal is that true power does not reside in loud confrontations or immediate anger. It lies in the quiet, disciplined observation of those around you. We often project our own loyalty and love onto family members, blinding ourselves to their true, sometimes toxic nature. When betrayal comes from the people we trust the most, our greatest weapon is emotional detachment and calculated patience. By stepping back and letting the greedy underestimate you, you allow them to orchestrate their own inevitable downfall. Ultimately, protecting your peace and legacy requires the absolute courage to enforce hard boundaries, even against your own blood. If you've ever had to outsmart the betrayal of someone you trusted, share your story in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button for more tales of absolute justice.